The cold didn't ask for permission that early morning in Marfa, a small town in rural Texas. He would simply arrive creeping and merciless, crossing empty streets, crashing against old facades, seeping into the bones of those who had nowhere else to go. The streetlights flickered in the dry desert wind, casting long shadows on the cracked asphalt, like scars that never completely disappeared. It was a heavy silence, the kind that doesn't soothe. It only reminds you that something is missing. Leaning against the side wall of an old closed shop, it was Mason Smith, one war veteran. It wasn't hard to see it in his rigid shoulders, in his instinctively alert posture, even when his body seemed too tired to react. The dark coat he wore was thick, worn by time, but still sturdy. The kind of clothing one learns to appreciate after experiencing far worse nights than this one. The wind lifted the hem of the fabric, revealing boots marked by years of use, dust, and memories that wouldn't fade. Mason kept his gaze fixed on some undefined point ahead, as if observing something no one else could see. His clear eyes reflected the distant gleam of an old sign, but behind that reflection lay something else. Compressed memories, organized with military discipline, locked away where no one could touch them. He breathed slowly, controlling each breath as he had learned in another time, in another place, when breathing incorrectly could mean not returning home. The world passed him by unnoticed. A distant car crossed the main avenue, the sound of tires echoing too fast to create a connection. A door slammed shut somewhere, perhaps due to the wind, perhaps due to human carelessness. Marfa slept, protected by the comfort of warm walls and thick blankets. Mason Smith did not sleep. War veterans rarely sleep like other people. The cold seemed to test his resistance, as if trying to elicit some reaction from him. Mason pressed his arms against his body, feeling the weight of the coat on his chest. That coat wasn't just a piece of clothing. It was shelter, it was a boundary. It was a thin line between enduring another night and giving in. He knew exactly what it meant to not have enough protection. He knew what it was like to feel his body tremble while his mind remained strangely lucid, too alert to rest. A distant bell rang, perhaps from the church at the end of the street, marking an indefinite hour. The sound pierced the icy air and reached Mason like a soft, almost ironic call. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the inner silence broke into ancient echoes. Not clear images, not complete scenes, just sensations. The same cold on another continent, the same wind mixed with dust and fear, the same silence before something happens. When she opened her eyes again, there was something different in the air. It wasn't the weather, it wasn't the wind. It was a feeling hard to name, that raw intuition that only a war veteran can carry this. She had been trained for years in survival. Something was about to happen. Not an explosion, not an armed confrontation, but a moment. One of those small, almost invisible moments that redefine everything after they pass. Mason looked away and noticed movement on the other side of the street. A silhouette too small to be there at that hour. Then another. Short, hurried, irregular steps. He didn't move. He observed. He assessed. The habit had never left him. Every detail mattered. The distance, the rhythm, the silence broken by a breath too weak for the Texan cold. The wind picked up, sending an involuntary shiver through his already weary body. Mason clenched his teeth. That night wasn't just another one. The cold wasn't just cold, and he wasn't there by chance, even if life insisted on treating him as if it were. At that moment, under the dim lights of Marfa, Texas, a war veteran, forgotten by the world, was about to be faced with a simple, brutal, and definitive choice. A choice that wouldn't demand medals, wouldn't receive immediate applause, wouldn't attract any attention at first. It would only require what war never managed to completely take from him: humanity. And while the wind howled between the old buildings and the city continued to sleep, destiny approached in small, silent, vulnerable steps. Mason Smith didn't know it yet, but that cold night was about to reveal to the world who he truly was. Not as a soldier, not as a survivor, but as a man. As this story begins to unfold, you might realize it's not just about a forgotten war veteran in the Texas cold. It's about silent choices, about humanity when no one is watching. And if this beginning has already stirred something in you, a memory, an emotion, a respect. This is the kind of story that deserves to continue reaching more people. A simple like helps this account not get lost in the silence, just as Mason almost did. Subscribing to the channel is a way to walk with us to the end of this journey. Here, each story is told with purpose, depth, and truth. Your support keeps alive narratives that the world insists on ignoring. Stay with us. This story will still touch deeper places. The routine of Mason Smith. A war veteran began even before the sun touched the arid horizon of Marfa, Texas. Not because he had commitment schedules or someone waiting for him, but because his body simply no longer knew how to sleep in. The war had taught his body to wake up with any noise, any change in the air, any invisible threat. Even now, years after leaving the battlefield, his brain still operated as if it were in hostile territory. He rose slowly, respecting the pain that seemed to have settled permanently in his joints. The morning chill seeped through the thin walls of the small room he rented at the back of an old building, almost forgotten by the city. The space was simple, almost austere. A narrow bed, a wooden table marked by deep scratches, a chair too stiff to be comfortable. There were no photos, no mementos on display. Mason had learned that certain objects speak too loudly. The coffee was always the same, strong, bitter, prepared with mechanical, precise movements, as if each gesture had been rehearsed for years. He drank it in silence, looking out the small, fogged window, watching the street slowly awaken. Marfa was a city that seemed suspended in time, too artistic for some, too isolated for others. For Mason, it was simply a place where nobody asked too many questions. When he went out, he walked the same routes every day. He passed by the local grocery store where Emma Harper. The attendant always greeted him with a respectful, though restrained smile. She knew he was a war veteran, everyone knew, but no one dared bring it up. There was an invisible line between curiosity and respect that the town had learned not to cross with Mason Smith. The neighbors watched him from a distance, some with silent admiration, others with barely disguised suspicion. A man like him, alone, too quiet, bearing scars that weren't clearly visible, that always provoked judgment. Mason felt those stares as he had felt so many others before, in airports, in bars, in cities that didn't know what to do with soldiers after the war ended. In the afternoon, he used to sit on a bench near the central square, not to socialize, but to observe. Children running around, couples talking, the ordinary daily life he had fought to protect, but of which he had never felt a part again. Sometimes he saw Mia Harper, Emma's daughter, playing near the fountain, laughing loudly, without any fear of the world. That sound, childlike laughter, had the strange power to soothe and hurt at the same time. Mason quickly looked away, as if touching something too hot. There was also Oliver Johnson. Oliver, the owner of the mechanic shop, occasionally offered Mason small jobs. Nothing permanent. Simple repairs, cleaning, occasional help. Mason accepted without wounded pride. Work was work. Structure was survival. Oliver respected his silence. He never asked about the war, never commented on the nightly episodes when Mason would lie motionless, staring blankly for long minutes, as if he were hearing voices that no one else could hear. At night, the war veteran would return to his room. He ate little. He would sit on the bed and remove his boots with almost ritualistic care. It was at that moment that his inner defenses began to crumble. The absolute silence didn't help. On the contrary, he would turn on the old radio just to fill the space with human voices, even distant ones. News, low country music, weather forecasts, anything that would keep him anchored in the present. The internal conflicts never subsided. Mason struggled daily against the feeling of worthlessness, against the unspoken question that haunted him. If the war is over, why are you still fighting? He knew he was a war veteran, but the world seemed unsure what to do with that once the uniforms were put away. There were no parades, no speeches, just silence and a cruel expectation of normalcy. In Marfa, he was known, but not integrated, respected, but not invited, seen, but rarely truly seen. Mason didn't complain. He had learned to exist on the margins, where control was greater and pain at least predictable. Still, There were nights when the weight of this solitude seemed heavier than any backpack he had ever carried into combat. And yet, he kept going, day after day, step after step, because war veterans don't give up easily. They learn to endure. They learn to keep going, even when there's no applause, even when no one is watching. Mason Smith didn't live. He resisted. And in that quiet town in rural Texas, that silent resistance was about to be put to the test in a way he could never have predicted. Before he became known in Marfa, Texas, like the silent man with firm steps and a distant gaze, Mason Smith, he was just an ordinary boy from rural America, long before he became a war veteran. Before the invisible scars and the rigid discipline etched onto his body, he was a boy who ran barefoot through dirt streets in an even smaller town in North Texas, where everyone knew each other by their first name, and the summers seemed endless. Mason grew up in a simple, light-colored wooden house that always smelled of fresh coffee in the morning and home-cooked food in the late afternoon. His father, Robert Smith. He worked long hours as a truck driver. He wasn't a man of many words, but he carried an unwavering code of ethics. To do what needed to be done, even when no one was watching. His mother, Helen Smith. She was the heart of the home, gentle, firm, with a gaze that seemed to see beyond words. It was from her that Mason inherited the sense of empathy that the war would later try to take from him. Mason's childhood wasn't perfect, but it was solid. He learned the value of responsibility early on. He helped his mother with small tasks, waited for his father to return from long trips, sitting on the porch, watching the horizon as if it were a silent ritual between the two. At night, Robert used to tell stories, not of war, but of the road, of people he had met, of difficult choices made far from home. Mason listened attentively, absorbing each word as if they were unofficial survival lessons. At school, Mason wasn't the most popular, nor the most withdrawn. He was that reliable boy, called upon when something needed to be done right. Teachers saw in him a calm, disciplined potential. Classmates knew they could count on him. There was a natural leadership in his demeanor, not based on imposition, but on example. When someone fell, Mason helped them up. When someone was excluded, he stayed nearby silently, offering his presence. Mason's dreams were simple. He talked about building something of his own, maybe working in mechanics, maybe opening a small business. He liked old cars, fixing broken things, understanding how everything worked inside. There was also the desire to travel, to see beyond the borders of that place, too small to contain all the questions that were beginning to arise in his teenage mind. It was during this phase that the idea of military service began to creep in, almost without warning. Not as an obsession, but as a distant calling. There were flags on poles, speeches on television, stories of honor, purpose, belonging. Mason saw in the soldiers something that resonated with the values taught at home: discipline, loyalty, sacrifice. His father never directly encouraged him, but he never discouraged him either. He simply said one night, looking firmly into his son's eyes, "If you go, go knowing why." The decision didn't come in a single moment. It came from the sum of many, from the feeling that he needed to do something bigger than himself, that there was a role waiting to be filled. Mason believed, with the conviction typical of youth, that he was ready. That physical strength and good values were enough, that courage was sufficient. When he announced his decision to his family, silence fell over the table. Helen tried to smile, but her eyes filled with suppressed tears. Robert nodded slowly, respecting his son's choice, even knowing that some paths change a person forever. That night, Mason slept little, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. The world finally seemed open before him. The day of departure was clear and hot. The suitcase was small, the farewells were restrained. Mason hugged his mother tightly, feeling for the first time a strange tightness in his chest. He promised to return. He promised to write. He promised to be careful. Promises made with the honesty of someone who didn't yet know the true weight of words. Survival. As he crossed the city limits, Mason Smith was not yet a war veteran. He was just a young American full of convictions, believing that the world made sense when you chose the right side. He didn't know that he was leaving behind not only his home, but a version of himself that would never return the same way. Everything he was, his childhood, his values, his intact humanity, would accompany him to the battlefield. And all of it would be put to the test. Because before war transforms men, it first tests who they were before it. The war did not announce its arrival. Mason Smith, with immediate explosions. It began more subtly, almost politely, as if giving him time to believe he was prepared. The first smell that struck him wasn't gunpowder, but hot dust mixed with metal. The first sound wasn't gunfire, but the synchronized clatter of boots on the hard ground. Still, something inside him recognized immediately. This was no place to return to unchanged. Mason learned quickly, too quickly. He learned to listen to the silence as a warning. He learned that the body reacts before the mind. He learned to differentiate between real and imagined danger, even though both caused the same tightness in his chest. House soldier. He was efficient, disciplined, and respected. As a man, he was beginning to fragment into parts that no longer knew how to come back together. Days on the battlefield blended together. Relentless sun, freezing nights. The constant feeling that time had lost all known logic. Mason clung to small rituals, cleaning equipment, mentally reviewing procedures, writing letters that weren't always sent. Each repeated gesture was an attempt to maintain some control in an environment that fed on chaos. That's where he met Matthew Williams, a younger soldier, always trying to ease the tension with simple, almost naive comments. Mateo spoke of his family, of plans for after the war, of a life that seemed too distant to be real. Mason listened more than he spoke. He protected Mateo as best he could. In combat, protection is never just physical, it's emotional, silent, made of quick decisions that no one sees. Then came the day that never left him. There was no clear warning, just a change in the air. An unsettling silence. Mason felt it before he understood. He shouted orders. The world shattered into noise and movement. When it all ceased, Mateo no longer responded. The body was there, but the life was not. Mason knelt beside him, his hands trembling despite all the training. He called his name once, twice, 3 times. The war did not answer. That moment settled inside Mason like a wound that never healed. There was no blood on his hands, but there was enough guilt to weigh tons. He knew, rationally, that he had done everything he could. War, however, respects no logic. It chooses its victims and leaves the survivors with unanswered questions. After that, something changed. Mason continued carrying out missions. He remained a good soldier. But the world began to be seen through a different lens. Loud noises made his body react before his thoughts. Sudden movements triggered automatic reflexes. Sleep became a hostile territory, invaded by fragmented images, never complete, always enough to steal his rest. There were nights when he would wake up with his heart racing, convinced that he needed to act, to protect, to react. Others when he would simply lie motionless, staring into the darkness, trying to remember where he was. The war wasn't confined to the battlefield. It seeped into the intervals, the silences, the spaces between one thought and another. Mason also lost something less visible, but equally devastating: a sense of emotional invulnerability. He had previously believed that strength meant enduring without breaking. On the battlefield, he learned that everyone breaks. Some just make less noise. Every friend lost, every impossible decision, every second of delay added weight. A weight that couldn't be dropped at the end of the day. There was a specific moment etched in his memory like a silent film. Mason was alone, watching the horizon after a long operation. The sky slowly changed color. It was beautiful, strangely beautiful, and yet he couldn't feel anything. Not peace, not relief, just a functional emptiness. It was then that he realized something essential had been ripped from him, and he didn't know how to get it back. When the service ended, there was no feeling of victory, only exhaustion. Mason returned home with his body whole, but his mind fragmented. He brought with him medals he never displayed, stories he never told, and a silence that became his most reliable defense. The world called him war veteran, but nobody explained what to do with everything that came along with that title. The scars of the battlefield weren't on his face, nor on his hands. They were in the instincts that never switched off. in the gazes he avoided, in the way he always sat with his back to the wall, in the difficulty of trusting silence. The war didn't kill him, but it also didn't let him go completely, let him go. And even years later, in a quiet town in rural Texas, all it took was the wrong sound, a specific smell, or an intense chill to pull Mason Smith back, not physically, but emotionally. Because some battles don't end when the shooting stops. They continue inside those who survived. The night in Marfa, Texas. It seemed to be repeating a pattern that was all too familiar for Mason Smith, a war veteran. The cold advanced slowly, filling every empty space between the old buildings, descending through the streets like a conscious presence. Mason walked with his coat buttoned up to his neck, his hands in his pockets, his breathing controlled. For anyone else, it would have been just another cold night in rural Texas. For him, the cold always carried something more, a bodily memory, an ancient warning that kept him alert. He had finished a small job in the workshop. Oliver Johnson. He was heading towards his room. The clock showed a little after 10. Marfa was almost completely silent. The shop windows reflected his own distorted image, a solitary man walking without haste, but without rest. It was then that Mason noticed something out of place. Not a loud sound, not a cry for help, just a detail that didn't fit the scene. Near the old, disused bus stop, there was movement. Too little, too irregular. Mason slowed his pace, keeping his distance. His veteran instincts took over before he could even rationalize. He observed. He assessed. Two figures, one adult, the other clearly a child. The child was trembling, hugging herself, wearing clothes that were too thin for that temperature. The woman, Mason would later learn her name was Harper Williams. She seemed exhausted. Her face was marked by fatigue, her eyes vacant, as if she were fighting against something much bigger than the cold. She held an almost empty plastic bag and tried to shield the child from the wind with her own body, failing with each stronger gust. Mason felt a tightening in his chest. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. The same feeling he'd had in conflict zones when he saw civilians trapped in impossible situations. He tried to move on. He told himself it wasn't his problem, that he had no resources, that he had no energy, that he no longer had the strength to get involved. But his feet didn't obey immediately. The child looked in his direction, a quick, almost shy glance. There was no explicit request, there were no words, just eyes too big for such a small face, reflecting fear and cold in equal measure. Mason stopped. At that moment, something broke inside him. Not dramatically, not like a collapse. It was a silent, profound snap. He remembered Matthew Williams, the way the young soldier spoke of his family, of the promise of a simple future. He remembered the feeling of failing to protect someone. The past and the present collided brutally. Mason approached slowly, keeping his voice low and controlled. "Is everything all right?" he asked, more out of human protocol than out of expectation of an answer. Harper looked up, surprised. There was understandable distrust there, mixed with a thread of hope that she seemed unwilling to admit. She explained quickly. The bus didn't come. The phone died. There was no money for a motel. The child, my Harper, her daughter, was growing increasingly cold. Her words tumbled out, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space in someone's world. Mason listened in silence. He had always listened well. In the end, he made no promises. He offered no grand solutions. He simply made a decision. He took off his own coat. The wind hit his body immediately like a blade. Without hesitation, he knelt before Mia and placed the coat over the girl's shoulders, adjusting it carefully, as if it were the most important thing in the world. Harper tried to refuse. He said he needed it too. Mason shook his head firmly. "I can handle it," he replied. And he knew it was true. War veterans learn to endure the cold, but they also learn, when they aren't too broken, to recognize when someone else can't. That simple gesture changed everything. Not because it saved the world, not because there was applause, but because it was seen. A man passing by slowed his pace. A window opened. Someone took their cell phone out of their pocket. Without Mason realizing it, that intimate moment began to spread silently. The cold intensified, now against Mason's exposed body. But he remained there, ensuring Mia was warm, speaking few words, maintaining his presence. For him, this wasn't heroism, it was a moral obligation. It was the same logic that had guided him on the battlefield, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The event that called to him wasn't just the encounter with that child. It was what it awakened. Mason felt something he hadn't felt in years. Immediate purpose, clear, simple, unambiguous. That night, the war wasn't calling him back. Humanity was. And as the cold punished his body and the world began to pay attention to that silent war veteran, Mason Smith crossed a point of no return. From there, his story would no longer be just about surviving. It would become about acting, even when the cost was personal, even when no one promised anything in return. The cold that hit the body of Mason Smith. After handing over the coat, the chill wasn't just physical. It was a cold that pierced deeper layers, touching ancient regions of memory, places where resistance had already been tested to the limit. Still, he remained kneeling for a few seconds before Maishi carefully adjusted the fabric around the child's small shoulders with almost ceremonial care. There was no hurry in her movements. Each gesture was precise, controlled, as if the whole world had slowed down to observe that moment. Mason felt the wind cut his skin, but he didn't flinch. War veterans learn early on to differentiate pain from threat. This was discomfort, not danger. He had faced far worse conditions. The real challenge wasn't the cold of that night in Marfa, Texas, but in the silent battle that raged within him. The part that told him to keep his distance, the part that had learned over time that getting involved always comes at a price. Harper Williams. He watched in silence, holding his daughter's hand tightly. Tears welled in his eyes, not of despair, but of something rarer, relief. She tried to speak, to thank him, to explain again. Mason raised his hand slightly, a simple gesture that asked for calm. "She needs to warm up first," he said, his voice firm, low, without dramatization. It wasn't a heroic phrase. It was a functional order, one of those he had given hundreds of times in critical situations. He stood up slowly, his body protesting the sudden change in temperature. He took his old cell phone out of his pocket. The cracked screen lit up with difficulty. The signal was weak, but sufficient. Mason called Oliver Johnson. He didn't explain everything. He just said he needed help. Oliver didn't ask any questions. He just replied that he was on his way. In small towns, some relationships work like that, based on silent trust. While they waited, Mason positioned himself strategically, using his own body as a barrier against the north wind. It was an automatic instinct, inherited from the battlefield. He calculated the direction of the gusts, adjusted his position, observed Mia's breathing. All this without seeming conscious of what he was doing. For him, protecting was a reflex, not an elaborate decision. The child began to relax gradually. The trembling subsided. Mia looked at Mason with curiosity, no longer with fear. "Are you a soldier?" she asked, her thin voice breaking the silence. The question pierced Mason like an unexpected shot. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I was," he replied. There was no pride in the answer, no sadness, just truth. Harper lowered her head, absorbing the weight of those words. She understood, in that instant, that this man wasn't there by chance, that his help didn't come from excess, but from experience. Mason Smith wasn't saving the situation to feel good about himself. He was doing it because he knew exactly what happens when nobody does anything. Oliver's car arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Other residents began to approach, drawn by the unusual activity. Whispers, gazes, raised cell phones. Mason noticed, but didn't react. Exposure was never something he sought. Still, he didn't back away. He didn't hide. His priority remained the same. Oliver opened the car door and offered immediate shelter. Mason helped Harper and Mia inside, making sure the child was comfortable. Only then did he take a step back, feeling the full force of the cold. His body trembled now, but he maintained his composure. War veterans don't show weakness easily, not out of pride, but out of habit. Someone offered him an extra coat. Mason declined with a discreet nod. Not out of stubbornness, but because he knew that night wasn't about him. He needed to remain whole, present, aware. The act of courage had already been performed. Now came the hardest part, sticking to the decision. As the car drove away toward a makeshift shelter, Mason stood there for a few seconds, alone again, surrounded by people who now looked at him differently. Not as the silent man of the city, not as the isolated veteran, but as someone who, despite everything, had chosen to act. He took a deep breath. He felt his heart slow down. The cold persisted. The memories too. But something had changed. For the first time in a long time, Mason Smith felt that his skills, those shaped by war, trauma, and loss, still had a purpose that didn't involve destruction. They could be used to protect, to care, to preserve. That night, the act of courage wasn't facing an armed enemy. It was allowing oneself to feel again. It was putting someone above oneself. It was accepting that, even broken, a war veteran can still be whole when choosing humanity. And that choice, made in the biting Texas cold, began to echo far beyond that silent street. The silence that returned to dominate the streets of Marfa. Texas, after the car of Oliver Johnson disappeared around the corner, bringing no relief to Mason Smith. On the contrary, he stood there for a few moments, feeling the cold penetrate without his coat, as if the environment itself were exacting a price for the choice he had made. His body trembled now without resistance, and there was no one left to protect. Only him, and that which always returned when the adrenaline dissipated, the internal conflict. Mason walked slowly to his room, each step heavier than the last. The cold seemed more aggressive, or perhaps it was just the absence of distraction that made it unbearable. Closing the door behind him, he leaned against the wood and slid down to a sitting position on the floor. He took a deep breath, trying to regulate his heart rate. War veterans know exactly how to control their bodies. The problem is when the mind decides to ignore any command. The images began to appear without warning, not as complete scenes, but as fragments. The hand of Matthew Williams slipping from his own. The muffled sound of a distant explosion. The feeling of failure, even when everything had been done correctly. Mason closed his eyes tightly, pressing his temples. That night had opened a door he had kept locked for years, to help me and Harper. It had been the right decision. He knew that rationally. Still, the wounded part of his mind began to question everything. What if something had gone wrong? What if it hadn't been enough? What if getting involved again meant losing someone else? War had taught him that attachment breeds vulnerability, and vulnerability on the battlefield costs lives. The next day, the city awoke differently. Not because anything physical had changed, but because people's gaze upon Mason had transformed. He noticed this immediately as he went out to buy coffee. Whispers ceased when he passed, gazes lingered. Some carried admiration, others excessive curiosity. There were also those laden with silent judgment, as if a sudden act of kindness shattered the image they had built of him. At the grocery store, Emma Harper. She observed him with unusual attention. She said nothing immediately. She simply handed him the coffee, and before he could walk away, whispered, "My niece." "She's fine." Mason nodded, unsure how to respond. Explicit gratitude always disconcerted him. He preferred clear orders, defined objectives. Open emotions were unstable ground. Tension rose when someone mentioned the video. Mason hadn't seen it, nor did he want to. Someone had recorded the moment he handed the coat to the child. The video had spread rapidly. Comments appeared. Words like hero, angel, example. Mason felt his stomach churn. He didn't recognize himself in any of those labels. The war had taught him to distrust overly simplistic narratives. The biggest conflict didn't stem from the external exposure, but from the internal impact it caused. Being seen meant being remembered. It meant that his identity as a war veteran, something he had learned to hide, to survive emotionally, was once again at the center. People wanted to know where he served, what he had experienced, how he felt. Questions he didn't know or couldn't answer. That night, Mason had one of the worst episodes since returning from the war. Sleep came heavily, but it was short. He woke up gasping for air, the dark room blurring with old memories. He sat up abruptly, his body in a defensive position, as if he were back in hostile territory. It took him minutes to realize where he was. Minutes that felt like hours. He sat up in bed, his breathing uneven, his hands trembling. Helping someone had rekindled everything he had kept under control. The conflict was clear now. Remaining isolated meant surviving in silence. Getting involved meant reliving the pain. Mason wondered, for the first time in a long time, if solitude truly protected him, or merely kept him frozen in place. The next day he crossed paths with Harper Williams on the street. She hesitated before approaching, respecting his space. She thanked him again, with simple, sincere words. She said that Mia had been asking about him. Mason felt a tightness in his chest. It wasn't fear, it was something more complex. A connection beginning to form where before there had only been emptiness. This was the real, greater conflict. Allowing himself to form bonds in a world that had already taken so much from him. For a war veteran, loving, protecting, and caring are not light acts. They are choices that demand daily courage. Mason was facing his most difficult battle yet, not against a visible enemy, but against the part of himself that believed he didn't deserve peace, connection, or redemption. And while Marfa continued watching, waiting for more gestures, more answers, Mason Smith walked toward a critical point. A place where he would have to decide whether he would continue living merely to resist, or whether he would accept facing the pain in order to, perhaps finally begin to live. The rupture didn't happen explosively. There were no screams, no immediate tears, nor a collapse visible to an outside observer. For Mason Smith. As a war veteran, it came as the deepest things do, silently, slowly, inevitably. It was on a cold dawn, a few days after the event, when Marfa, Texas. It seemed suspended in a constant state of waiting, as if the entire city sensed that something was about to give way. Mason sat alone in his room, the lights off, the radio off. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't seeking noise to drown out his thoughts. The silence was now intentional, necessary. The coat he had given to my it was no longer there, hanging in the corner, as it always had been. The absence of that simple object amplified the emptiness of the room, as if it had taken with it a part of the structure that kept it functional. His body was exhausted, but his mind remained alert. Mason had tried to sleep, but had failed repeatedly. Each time he closed his eyes, it wasn't the cold of Marfa that returned. It was the suffocating heat of the battlefield, the smell of dust, the distant sound of voices that would never answer again. He took a deep breath, resting his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his calloused hands. That's when the memory came back whole, without fragments, without cuts. A memory he had avoided for years. The exact moment he realized that Matthew Williams, it would never return. Not just the moment of loss, but what came after. The heavy silence that followed. The feeling of utter futility. The question that had never found an answer. Why him and not me? Mason's chest tightened. His breath became short. His body reacted as if it were under attack again. He tried to apply the techniques he had learned. Breath control, focus on the present, physical grounding. Nothing worked. For the first time since returning from the war, he couldn't contain the emotional avalanche. The tears came without warning, heavy, silent, laden with years of restraint. Mason didn't sob. He simply let them fall, one after another, marking the wooden floor. It was as if each tear carried a name, a face, an impossible decision. It wasn't just Mateo, it was everyone. And at the same time, it was himself, the man who had left full of convictions and returned fragmented. The image of Mai shivering with cold that night. His thoughts mingled with the memory of Mateo lying on the ground. Two distant realities, connected by the same invisible thread, the inability to protect everyone. Mason felt the guilt rise like an old tide. If only I had been faster, if I had done something differently. What if I hadn't survived? Irrational but persistent thoughts, fueled by years of silence. He pounded his fist against his chest, an instinctive attempt to expel the pain that seemed too great to contain within him. The sound echoed through the empty room. Mason shrank, his shoulders hunched, as if finally accepting the weight he had carried since the war. This was not weakness, it was emotional exhaustion in its purest form. For a brief moment, the idea of giving up crossed his mind, not explicitly, not as a plan, but as a feeling of surrender, of wanting everything to simply stop, for the internal noise to cease, for the constant struggle to exist to come to an end. For a war veteran, this thought doesn't come as dramatic despair, but as a weariness too profound to ignore. That's when something different happened. In the midst of that silent collapse, Mason heard a distant laugh. Childlike, brief. It probably came from the street, from some nearby house. But to him, at that moment, it sounded like a call. His mind immediately searched for the image of Mia, now warm, now safe. A living child, laughing because someone had done something simple but decisive. His perspective could serve a greater purpose than isolation. Mason slowly raised his head. His face was wet, his eyes red, his breathing still uneven. He realized something with painful clarity. The war had taken many things from him, but it hadn't completely erased his ability to choose. To choose to act, to choose to protect, to choose to feel, even when it hurt. The rupture didn't destroy him, it exposed him. For the first time, Mason wasn't fighting to contain the pain, he was allowing it to exist. And in that brutal realization, there was a seed of something new. Not naive hope, not easy redemption, but the possibility of continuing, not just resisting, but rebuilding himself from the broken pieces. As dawn began to gently illuminate the window, Mason was still sitting there, exhausted, vulnerable, but whole in a different way. The breaking point had passed, leaving behind not answers, but a truth impossible to ignore. He could no longer run from his own humanity. And for a war veteran who had spent years trying to survive the silence, accepting this truth was the most painful and most necessary step of his entire journey. The dawn did not bring immediate peace to Mason Smith. When the first light of day filtered through the cracks in the window of her small room in Marfa, Texas, she found a war veteran exhausted, his body aching, his mind still echoing the fragments of the previous night. The breaking point hadn't been clean, nor liberating. It had been raw, disorganized, real. Mason felt as if he had walked through an internal minefield and somehow was still standing, without knowing exactly why. He stood up with difficulty, his feet touching the cold floor. His body reacted with the same reflex as always, alert, defensive. But something was different. The weight in his chest hadn't disappeared, but now it had form, a name, a context. The pain was no longer diffuse. It had become specific, and that strangely made it possible to continue. Stepping outside, Mason realized the city was more awake than usual, not just physically, but emotionally. The incident from that cold night had spread far beyond what he'd imagined. Not just the video, but the story behind it. The war veteran no one really knew was now the talk of the town, and that presented him with a challenge greater than any patrol he'd ever led, being seen without his armor. Walking down the main street, Mason felt the stares, some filled with genuine respect, others with intrusive curiosity, a few with incomprehension. He kept his pace steady, his posture erect, not out of pride, but for survival. The war had taught him that when everyone is watching, every movement needs to be conscious. He sat on the park bench, the same one he always used. The light breeze rustled the dry trees, and the distant sound of a passing pickup truck seemed amplified too much. Mason took a deep breath, focusing on the present, as he had learned in psychological training that never seemed enough. It was there, on that time-worn bench, that the true climax began to form. Not in an explosion, but in an internal confrontation. Mason's mind began to revisit everything. Not only Matthew Williams, but other names, other voices, other decisions made in seconds that echoed for years. The difference now was that he wasn't trying to push those memories away. He faced them, one by one, like a commander reviewing reports after a failed mission, without self-deception, without heroism. He wondered, with brutal honesty, who he had become after the war. Not what the city saw, not what the video showed, but who he was when no one was watching. A broken war veteran, yes, but also a man who still reacted when someone needed him. That didn't erase the past, but perhaps it gave it new meaning. That's when Harper Williams. She appeared again, accompanied by Mai. There was no rush that time. There was no emergency, just quiet footsteps. Mason felt his body stiffen instinctively, followed by a slow release when he recognized the child's face. Mia smiled. An open, simple smile, free of any weight Mason carried. She approached fearlessly and said something that struck Mason harder than any adult words could. "Mum said you weren't too cold because of me." Mason felt breathless for a second. That simple sentence carried a truth he had avoided admitting. He hadn't just been cold, he had chosen to feel it, and that changed everything. Harper thanked him again, but this time it wasn't just gratitude. It was recognition. She said that night, Mason hadn't just helped. He had reminded her that there were still people willing to act without expecting anything in return. Mason listened in silence, his gaze fixed on the floor. When he replied, his voice was low but firm. "I know what it's like to wait for help that doesn't come." This was the exact moment when the emotional climax solidified. Mason realized that his pain didn't have to be an end. It could be a point of connection. A war veteran doesn't just carry trauma, he carries perspective. And for the first time, he saw that in the days that followed, Mason made decisions he had avoided for years. He returned to the community center and officially enrolled in a veterans support program. He didn't tell heroic stories. He didn't seek easy comfort. He simply sat in a room with other men and women who shared the same weary look. The silence shared there was more powerful than any speech. He started sleeping a little better. Not well, but better. The crises didn't disappear. There were still difficult nights. There were still triggers. But now there was also something new. Emotional responsibility for himself. Mason understood that surviving was no longer enough. He needed to learn to live, even if that meant feeling pain along the way. The final symbolic moment came when Emma Harper. He returned the washed coat, carefully folded. Mason held the fabric for long seconds. That object now represented more than just thermal protection. It represented a choice. He could hang it back as a silent trophy or wear it as an active reminder of who he had chosen to be. Mason put on his coat and went for a walk. The cold that night was similar to the first, but he didn't feel abandoned. The war veteran still carried his scars. He would carry them forever. Overcoming wasn't about forgetting. It was about integrating, about accepting that the past doesn't completely define the future. Looking out at the open Texas sky, Mason took a deep breath and felt something rare. Not complete happiness, but stability. Ground firm enough to keep walking on. He hadn't won the war within himself, but he had won that specific battle. The battle that decides whether someone remains frozen in trauma or allows themselves to move forward, even if limping. At that moment, without applause, without medals, without headlines, Mason Smith, a war veteran, he overcame the greatest enemy he had ever faced. The belief that he was condemned to carry his pain alone, and that more than any gesture seen by the world was the true climax of his journey. Winter began to slowly recede from Marfa, Texas. But the cold still lingered in the mornings and evenings, like a persistent reminder of everything that had happened. Mason Smith. For a war veteran, time was no longer just a succession of identical days. He no longer woke up merely to endure. He woke up to continue. The difference was subtle, almost invisible to an outside observer, but profound enough to change the way he occupied his own body. Mason began walking through the city without the constant feeling of invading a space that didn't belong to him. The streets remained the same, the old buildings, the dry desert wind. But something in his gaze had shifted. He was still a war veteran. That would never cease to be true. But now that title wasn't just laden with pain. It was also laden with silent purpose. The office of Oliver Johnson Mason began to take on greater responsibilities. Oliver never formalized anything, never made speeches. But he came to trust him as one trusts someone who doesn't need to prove their worth. Working together created a stable rhythm. The metallic sound of the tools, the smell of oil and iron, the repetition of gestures helped Mason remain grounded in the present. Each entire day, without an emotional breakdown, was a victory that no one applauded, but that he recognized internally. The meetings at the community center continued. Some days Mason spoke. Other days, he just listened. There were stories similar to his and very different stories. There were younger veterans and others much older, all carrying their own versions of the same weight. Mason learned something fundamental there. Pain doesn't diminish when compared. It only changes form. And yet, sharing the space with those who understand made all the difference. It was at one of these meetings that Mason realized something he had never imagined possible. He wasn't just someone who needed help. He could also be someone who offered stability. One of the younger veterans, clearly on the verge of emotional collapse, sat silently beside him. Mason said nothing. He just stood there. That simple gesture, presence without pressure, was something he mastered better than any therapeutic technique. The war had taught him that, even at a high cost. As the months passed, Harper Williams and My They became a natural part of Mason's daily life, without forcing space, without creating emotional dependence. There were occasional encounters, simple conversations, shared meals at unlikely times. Mason never tried to assume a role that wasn't his. He knew that true care doesn't require possession, it requires respect. On a particularly cold afternoon, Mason and Mia walked to the edge of town, where the desert opened up in absolute silence. Mia spoke of small dreams, learning something new, drawing better, growing up without rushing. Mason listened attentively, something he had only recently learned to do. When Mia asked if he still had nightmares, Mason took a deep breath before answering. Sometimes, he said, but now I wake up knowing where I am. That simple, honest answer carried years of inner struggle. Mason's story didn't end with complete redemption. He didn't become a man free from his past. War veterans don't have that privilege. What he achieved was something more realistic and rarer, imperfect balance. He learned to recognize when trauma was overwhelming and when it was just fear trying to regain control. He learned that asking for help didn't erase his strength. On the contrary, it reorganized it. One night, almost a year after the episode that had changed everything, Marfa faced another intense cold front. The wind blew strongly, the streets were empty, and the silence seemed to echo. Mason left the house wearing his coat and walked to the same street where, on that distant night, he had made his choice. He stopped at the exact same spot, not out of nostalgia, but out of recognition. He stood there, observing the empty space, feeling the cold touch his face. For the first time, the cold didn't trigger panic or immediate memories of the battlefield. He was simply there, present, whole within his own imperfection. Mason understood with quiet clarity that this moment had been a turning point, not because it had made him better than others, but because it had reconnected him to something essential that the war had almost stolen from him. The ability to choose good, without orders, without strategy, without reward. Mason Smith would remain a war veteran until the last day of his life. He would continue to carry names that no one else remembered. He would continue to wake up some nights with a racing heart. He would continue to deal with difficult silences. But now he knew something that had previously eluded him. He was not condemned to live only as a survivor. The moral of her story isn't about exaggerated heroism, nor about complete redemption. It's about emotional responsibility, about the impact of small choices made in difficult times, about how a simple gesture can interrupt cycles of pain that seem immutable. The world saw Mason that cold night and tried to define him quickly. They called him a hero, an example, a symbol. Mason never recognized himself in those labels. He knew he had done nothing more than what he believed was right, and perhaps that is precisely where the most important truth of all lies. Because someone's true character isn't revealed in comfortable moments. It reveals itself when the cold sets in, when nobody is asking, when helping actually costs something. Mason Smith didn't change the world, but he changed the course of a life that night. And in doing so, he changed his own destiny. Sometimes that's all one can, and all one needs to do. And so, in a small town in rural Texas, the story of a war veteran came to an end, not with applause, but with respectful silence. A silence different from the one that had accompanied him for years. A silence that, for the first time, did not signify abandonment. It meant peace was possible. If you've made it this far, it's because this story has also found a place in you. Stories like Mason's aren't meant to be consumed quickly. They demand pause, listening, and reflection. And that's exactly the kind of narrative we continue to build here. If it resonates with you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that deal with humanity, silent choices, and lives that continue even after war. If you want, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end." I read it, and it helps me understand who's really following along until the very end. And if this story created some kind of connection on your end, a like is just a simple way to signal that, without having to say much. There's a video over here that directly relates to everything you just watched. Click on it and continue the journey with me there. The journey doesn't have to end here.